Hi, so today we're covering one of the crown jewels of the Imperium of Man, a place that's actually kinda nice in the 41st millennium. Well, nice as a gothic nightmare future can get. We're talking about Macragge. Thing is, if you're looking for it on a map, you gotta head out all the way to the eastern fringe, deep within the Ultima Segmentum. And this isn't just some random rock, it's a civilized world and a beacon for order in the galaxy. A galaxy which, by the way, is trying to actively eat itself in every regard. But what makes Macragge truly special, and honestly a bit of a political anomaly in the 41st millennium, is that it's one of the only planets that, aside from Terra and Mars, have been allowed to form its own little empires, as Macragge is the capital of Ultramar, a subsector of space where the laws actually somewhat work and the people aren't always miserable. Physically, Macragge is a bit of a contradiction. It's got a temperate climate and a gravity pretty close to what we're used to on Earth. But about 75% of the land is just brutal, jagged, life-defying mountains. Because of that, the 400 million people living there are actually clustered into the scant few habitable zones, leaving the peaks to the legends. And that's where things get interesting. High up on those impenetrable mountains sits the Fortress of Hera. This fortress monastery was one crafted for the Ultramarines, the poster boys of the Adeptus Astartes, and this is a massive, craggy cathedral of war that serves as the heart of their operations and the seat of power for the chapter master Marnius Calgar, and eventually the returned Primarch Guilliman. For nearly 10,000 years, the most important place on Macragge, and arguably the entire sector, was the Temple of Correction, as for 10 millennia Primarch Guilliman sat there in this massive marble throne, locked in a stasis field, where he was essentially a living corpse, frozen a second away from death, after a nasty run-in with his perverse brother Fulgrim. Because of this, Macragge became a massive pilgrimage site, with millions upon millions, if not billions of people would travel across the stars just to catch a glimpse at one of the Emperor's literal sons. It was a place of mourning, a place of hope, and a silent monument to a better age that everyone thought would be gone forever. But this is Warhammer, and things just can't stay dead. As in the closing days of the 41st millennium during the 13th Black Crusade, the unthinkable happened. Through a very ends justify the means alliance between tech priest Belisarius Cawl and an Eldari prophet named Yevrain, Guilliman was actually brought back to life, and he woke up, looked at the absolute mess that was the Imperium, and immediately, like the pencil pusher he is, went back to work. He cleared out the chaos forces upon his domain, hopped over to Terra, and had a very awkward chat with his papa, the Emperor, eventually returning to Macragge once again during the Plague Wars where Nurgle tried to turn his whole dominion into a swamp. Between the politics and the gods, you can't really talk about Macragge without talking about the Tyranids. This is a planet famous, or maybe infamous, for being the site of one of the most desperate stands in the history of the Imperium, the Battle of Macragge. When High Fleet Behemoth showed up, it wasn't just a simple space battle. It was a fight for the very soul and remains of the chapter. The Ultramarines eventually won, but it cost them dearly, including the entirety of their first company. However, today the planet is a literal fortress that has been prepared for another Tyranid assault. It's got massive polar defensive batteries and classified as tithe grade Adeptus None, meaning that it doesn't pay the main taxes that a government demands, be they money or men, as the tax that Ultramar pays is simply being the elite shield of the Imperium, where the Ultramarines reside on. It's a world built on discipline, a Roman-esque style government, which is under constant threat of annihilation from every which way. And it's a perfect starting point if you're ever looking to take a deeper dive into the realms of Ultramar. To understand why Macragge isn't really just another gothic hellscape like Baal or Medusa, we have to look back, way back, before the Emperor started his Great Crusade. This was during the Age of Strife, when the galaxy itself was being torn asunder by the very existence of warp storms, the birth of the god of excess, and a myriad of other issues, all simultaneously popping up and causing a brouhaha. These warp storms made travel impossible, and most human colonies were either dying out or turning into something horrific. However, Macragge, it was different. It was a bleak, rocky world that somehow managed to keep its head just above water for long enough for things to work out. They had this super Arthurian but totally cohesive society led by 2 officials called consuls. And while everyone else was losing their tech, Macragge actually kept their industries almost entirely intact. They even managed to keep their short-range warp ships and sublight craft functional, which meant they weren't just sitting in the dark once the warp storms passed. They were actually talking and trading with their neighbors. They knew they weren't alone, and that itself was one of the most massive legs up on the galaxy. A galaxy that at the time left most planets feeling lonely and very murdery. Then this inciting incident happens, and one of the Emperor's infant Primarchs get yeeted from Terra through literal space hell randomly, and Reboot Gaiman basically gets sent right to one of the better planets that any of the Primarchs landed on, Macragge, where he's found and adopted by one of those consuls, a man named Connor. Now, Connor wasn't your typical member of the ruling class. He wasn't one of the more pompous aristocrats. He was actually a man of the people. And while the other nobles were constantly sitting on their piles of gold and increasing their wealth without any real advancements, Connor was out there pushing for massive reforms, those that would help the common citizenry grow and expand, which would allow their forces in turn to grow and expand in kind. And he saw something quite special in Gaiman. Predictably, he turned out to be a literal youngling prodigy in every way, shape, and form imaginable. We're talking about a munchkin who was a master administrator and military genius before he even hit his teens. And he was one of, if not the best bureaucrats imaginable. You're basically looking at a demigod version of the boss baby. This was a perfect match. A visionary father and a son, literally biologically engineered for greatness. But because, again, it's 40k, we can't have nice things, at least not for very long. And while Gaiman was away in the mountains doing Primarchy things, specifically hunting down bandits, rebels, and stabilizing political situations at the fringes of Macragge, the political situation at the capital turned into a Shakespearean tragedy. The other consul, a guy named Galen, absolutely abhorred, hated, and loathed all of Connor's reforms. He represented the ideal rich politician who didn't want to share their toys and only wanted to concentrate more power behind his own domain. So he staged a coup and usurped the government. This was a rather classical power grab, and for a second it looked like Macragge was going to spiral into the same corruption and ruination that every other planet seemed to constantly fall into. Thing is, Galen made one massive mistake, and that mistake was around 10, maybe 12 feet tall. Angry, biologically roided out, Galen left Connor's son alive. When Gaiman found that his father had been murdered, he didn't just get mad, he became madly efficient. He marched back to the capital, absolutely dismantled Galen's forces, and took control. But instead of becoming another tyrant, the people saw what he was capable of and elected him as sole consul. Gaiman took everything his father Connor believed in, the ideal of a meritocracy, where it wasn't your identity or your title that helped you move up the rungs, but your hard work, your skill, and your dedication. Then he dialed it to 11. He rebuilt Macragge into a society where everyone worked for the common good. And by the time the Emperor finally showed up during the Great Crusade to find his lost son, he didn't find a wasteland like he was expecting. He found another thing entirely, a thriving mini Imperium which mirrored almost all his ideals, ready to take on the stars. When the Emperor actually came a-knockin', he was on this massive galaxy-spanning road trip called the Great Crusade, trying to find 20 lost super sons. And he was checking a neighboring system called Espandor, where he found out that everyone was fangirling over this legendary figure from a nearby world, the astounding son of Consul Connor. The Emperor hears what they were saying and what they described, then did a double take, and realized that's probably one of mine. And unlike most dads who had a chance to get off scot-free and never come back with the milk, he headed straight to the Macragge system, probably expecting to find a warlord or a survivalist cult, which had expanded beyond the norm. But instead he found something that actually seemingly shocked him. A society that is so prosperous, so advanced, and so well defended that unlike most of his lost sons' worlds, which were basically clinging to life, and if you removed the Primarch, it would collapse, Macragge was thriving. It was the ultimate proud dad moment for the Master of Mankind. It was something that he truly wished all his sons replicated, and the Emperor immediately decides to hand Guilliman the keys to his own legion, the Ultramarines, moving their entire base of operations straight to Macragge, with nary a stop in between. This wasn't just a sentimental choice, it was a strategic masterstroke because Macragge was already stable, industrial, and perfectly suited to take on a Space Marine Legion. As with the technology that would come with the Space Marines, they would be able to pump out a steady stream of recruits at a constant rate without having to terraform or drastically change anything. This would be an incredibly quick transitionary period. And this is one of the many reasons that the Ultramarines became the largest legion in the galaxy, while other legions had to struggle to find enough stable candidates, both due to genetic viability and because of the conditions of the realms. Ultramar had a wellspring, a surplus even, becoming a veritable factory of super soldiers. Now that we have talked about the how, we move on to Imperial legends. We know that the Emperor used his own genome to create a template for his sons, the Primarchs, imbuing them with superhuman powers. But when the ruinous powers snatched them away in those tiny little capsules and send them through the warp with the aid of Erda, who legitimately had no idea if she was sending her kids to a place that would lobotomize them or to a literal civilized heaven. The literal stuff of nightmares that they went through was able to affect them in a way that Erda hadn't foreseen. Surprise, throwing your kids into literal space hell isn't a good idea. And it laid in the seeds for the chaotic corruption that would eventually lead to the Horus Heresy. However, Guilliman's capsule, it was one of the most remarkably intact, allowing for the creation of one of the two purest and most resilient gene seed strains imaginable, only surpassed by a narrow margin by those of Lionel Johnson, Primarch of the First Legion. And since we're going into further detail, we must understand that when the noblemen stumbled upon Guilliman, they were out hunting in a leisurely manner, not for survival. And they found this crashed ship that had cleared out a significant area. And while they expected a monster or mutant to be right in the epicenter of it, instead they found a perfect child surrounded by a glowing nimbus of power, almost like a scene out of a Greco-Roman myth. Then the people brought the infant to Connor Guilliman, who didn't just see a weapon, a monster, or an abnormality. He saw a child that in the Roman tradition he would choose as his son, and he named him Reboot. The rest of the Primarch's childhood is spent much like the history of almost any other noble, just a super one. Now, if you thought the term prodigy was fitting for Guilliman, you'd be wrong. He was on a completely different level. By the time of his 10th birthday, and keep in mind, he's a Primarch, so he has an accelerated growth rate before stopping, meaning he probably looked closer to an adult, or maybe in his late teens, he had already mastered every single thing that the wisest scholars on Macragge could teach him. History, philosophy, science, mathematics. He didn't just learn them, he understood them on a base level, almost genetically, better than the people who were teaching him. But his real bread and butter, the thing that he was literally engineered for, was the art of war. His foster father, Connor, saw this and gave him a mission that was basically the ultimate entry-level military test. He sent Reboot to the far north, a place known as Illyrium. This was a brutal, mountainous wasteland filled with bandits and brigands who basically had been a thorn on Macragge's side forever. This was a region that no one had been able to tame. But Reboot, he didn't just beat them, he fought them in such a brilliant way that he actually won their respect. And he turned a land of criminals and brigands into a veritable fortress of loyal warriors, which realistically, if you view his entire breadth and width of history, this is just what he does. But while Reboot was busy being a tactical genius in the mountains, things in the capital were falling apart. You remember Consul Gallan, the man I mentioned before? Well, he was the face of the old, lazy, birthright aristocracy. The guys who were rich off the literal blood and sweat of their impoverished slaves. And Connor had spent his time and life actually making conditions livable for the common people, forcing the rich to provide more and more food along with housing, making them pay into building up the cities which they extracted wealth from. And naturally, this population didn't like that. They wanted their slaves. They wanted the cheap labor that would have people doing the jobs that they didn't want to do. They wanted their perfect lives back. So when the Golden Boy was away, Galen and his buddies staged a coup. They weren't just looking for a political shift. They wanted to erase everything the Connor had built. As Reboot and his army marched back home, they didn't see a victory parade. They saw smoke. Massive fires tearing through Macragge's city. The citizens were sprinting away in terror, telling Reboot that Galen's paid mercenaries had trapped Connor inside the Senate House. It was total anarchy. Drunken soldiers were looting in the streets, murdering people, while the very heart of the government was under siege. Reboot didn't hesitate. He let his Illyrian troops handle the mobs upon the streets, and he personally fought and slaughtered his way to the Senate House. In this incredibly climactic and heartbreaking moment, he finds his father, Connor, dying from an assassin's poisoned blade. For 3 straight days, while bleeding out and having surgeons hovering over him, Connor managed to direct the defenses of the building. With his very last breath, he told his son exactly who was responsible. He told him about Galen's treachery, and then he was gone. Now, if you're a corrupt noble on Macragge, this is exactly the moment. You know you've messed up. You didn't kill a politician, you killed the father of a demigod. And Reboot set out not just to restore order, he absolutely leveled the old system. He crushed the rebels, he executed Galen, and every last one of his co-conspirators, stripping their families of their titles, their lands, and their tithes. But he didn't just keep the spoils. He gave those farms and the estates to the hard-working settlers who had been literally slaving away for the nobility, farming those same lands. And he used that superhuman ability of his to reorganize the societal hierarchy from a noble-based aristocracy to a meritocracy. If you were honorable and you were hardworking, providing the best results for whatever you did, you'd be rewarded. Now, if you were corrupt or gained the system by title, identity, or anything else, like the corrupt from the olden days, well, you were out. Under his sole consulship, Macragge didn't just recover. It exploded into this golden age. This was a blueprint for what would eventually become the Realm of Ultramar, as this system was repeated over and over and over again on different worlds. And when the Emperor was playing his high-stakes games throughout the Great Crusade of Find My Super Sons and liberate human worlds from Xenos and other empires, he finally hits his jackpot on the system of Espador, where he finds that the locals just can't stop talking about Macragge. And he hears the description of an astounding son of Connor, spoken up in such reverence that he thinks, yeah, this fits. But because the warp is so fickle, chaotic, and untrustworthy, the Emperor's ship gets hit by sudden, constant warp squall, almost as if some elder entities were actively trying to delay him. These intense, localized warp storms knock him totally off course, and by the time he actually manages to pull up on Macragge, Reboot Guilliman has already been the big boss for about 5 years of the system. And those 5 years made a vast difference. Instead of a world in recovery, the Emperor finds an almost god-tiered civilization. Macragge was thriving, its people were fed, and the armies were top-notch. The cities were rebuilt out of glittering marble and shining steel. It wasn't just a planet, it was an active hub. Macragge's ships were already trading with nearby systems, solidifying a power base and bringing raw material and people back to it. The Emperor was honestly floored, realizing that Reboot Guilliman just wasn't one of his great generals of war. He was a visionary of an unsurpassed ability and scope. And when he finally met Guilliman and the big blue Boy Scout learned the truth about being a genetically engineered demigod, and I mean, how wouldn't he? He's like 3 times the size of an average person. Guilliman knelt and swore fealty to the Emperor, and by extension, the Ultramarines would finally find their father. Once Guilliman took control of the Legion that was literally genetically his kids, he didn't just stand around. He took the move fast, break things, then fix them later approach that the Great Crusade was famous for. But rather than just follow the praxis of his brothers, he added a level of organization that would make the most stringent modern-day CEO weep at the efficiency. When the Ultramarines moved their home base to Macragge, Guilliman started doing what he does best, win. He actually liberated more worlds during the Great Crusade than any other Primarch. But here's a twist. Big Boy Blue didn't just conquer a planet and leave it in ruins, like his frothing at the mouth brother Angron. He had this obsession with building governments, efficient ones at that. He was like the galaxy's most intense and obsessive urban planner. Every time the Ultramarines kicked out a tyrant or conquered a world, Guilliman made his first move to set up a functioning self-supporting defense system. He wasn't interested in planting a flag and building a fort. He wanted to plan a civilization around what the Ultramarines had conquered, one which would leave behind not only his advisors and built factories, but rather a legacy that tied the conquered world back to Ultramar in an endless cycle of trade and circulation. He established trade routes with the rest of the Imperium every time he conquered a world, and set up governments that actually were designed to care and foster higher standards of living for their people. This is why even 10,000 years later, the worlds he touched are often the most stable ones. He didn't just build an army, he built an empire that could actually survive without him. It was a brutal mix of military efficiency and genuine care for the little guy. That's what made the Ultramarines and Macragge seen as the gold standard for the Imperium. During the Horus Heresy, Macragge also became the seat of the Triumvirate, the ruling body of 3 Primarchs, founded by Reboot Guilliman, Sanguinius, and Lionel Johnson, and the heart of Imperium Secundus, the failsafe in case the Imperium had been wiped out by the traitors' horde. However, after this, the next time that Macragge proper rather than the system as a whole becomes important is during the First Tyrannic Wars. In particular, when the Tyranids were invading the world proper during the Battle of Macragge. When the Thunderhawk gunships finally touched down during the battle, the sight was something out of a nightmare. Imagine a landscape that had once been snow and mountains being replaced by new mountains, but these ones made out of piled up Tyranid corpses and shattered ceramite. The ground was scarred with massive steaming craters, as Titan plasma reactors had gone critical and been used as atomic arms. And the air was so thick with the dense stench of death, blood, bile, and viscera that supposedly it fouled up Vox grills of the Space Marines who had come to see what had happened to the world of Macragge after the Battle of Macragge had gone critical. In the south, the 7th Company landed and managed to link up with the ragtag group of survivors of the surface garrison, immediately diving into the subterranean tunnels in order to clear out the lingering infestation. But the North Pole was a different story. The 3rd Company was ambushed the very second they hit the ground, as thousands upon thousands of Xenos surged out of the tunnels' mouths and the ruined bunkers. This led to them requiring a heavy, absolutely destructive wall of fire from the Devastator squad, plus a little help from the Thunderhawk's heavy bolters to keep the swarms from swallowing them whole. Captain Fabian of the 3rd Company knew that he was walking into a tomb, so he decided not to rush. He waited for his 3 dreadnoughts to stomp off the gunships before descending into the fortress proper. And within those fortresses, leading to the very core of Ultramar's underground facilities, it wasn't an imperial world anymore. The inside of Macragge was Tyranid filled to an extreme extent. Mucus literally dropping off the ceilings and oozing out of the very rock and earth, with a musky alien stench filling the air in a perpetual miasma. The darkness itself became veritably alive, to the point that it screamed and echoed throughout the vents. As they pushed forward, they eventually found piles upon piles of dead Ultramarines and Tyranids who had been locked in a final embrace. Then Lictors, the terrifying camouflage apex predators of the Tyranids, jumped out of the bodies in a cacophony of destruction that forced the Ultramarines to use flamers in order to clear a path, completely destroying everything that was there, including the gene seed of the dead Ultramarines, who had sacrificed themselves to do that much damage. Eventually, the 3rd Company reached the lower Pentorum, the absolute heart of this fortress, and on the outside doors of this area, Tyranid bodies were piled up 6 deep, creating a literal carpet of chitin, claws, and viscera. And there they found them, in a perfect circle, the 1st Company Terminators, lying exactly where they had fought back to back to back to back, ad nauseum, until their very last bolter shell was spent, and their very last power fist flickered out. Every single one of them, during the Battle of Macragge, the most experienced and elite Ultramarines in existence, the company's greatest veterans, some would say the greatest in the galaxy, were wiped out to a man. To this day, the Battle of Macragge is a massive mix of sorrow and extreme pride for the chapter, to the point that every year the planet celebrates the Feast of Days, and they read out the names of all the fallen Ultramarines. This is when the entire planet of Ultramar stops in its tracks to celebrate and honor the sacrifice of those who saved the entire sector. But the scars of this world didn't just heal overnight. The first company was completely gone, and much of the world had been at least partly terraformed, with the third and seventh company of the Ultramarines basically a shadow of their former selves. It took decades, even with the secret auxiliary chapter of the Ultramarines lending them extra recruits, aspirants, and space marines. This is the Genesis chapter. That's their whole reason for existing, is to allow the Ultramarines to cheat their own size limitations. But in the typical Ultramarines fashion, they didn't just rebuild, they adapted, they improved. They actively went against the statements of the Holy Codex Astartes. They took the survivors who had stared into the maw of the Great Devourer and formed them into an elite specialized unit called Tyrannic War Veterans. These guys are the backbone of the reformed First Company, the best training, the most upgraded and up-to-date power armor, and a level of trauma-hardened experience that makes them the most effective anti-Tyranid force in the galaxy. This left the planet of Macragge physically changed, bloodied, and scarred. However, Ultramar was able to prove that even the hungriest beasts of the void can still be broken if you're willing to pay the price in blue and gold. So just when you thought Macragge had earned a 1,000-year nap after the Tyranids basically kicked their teeth in, the universe decides to throw a literal endgame boss at it. We're talking about the 13th Black Crusade. This wasn't just another raid. This was Abaddon the Despoiler finally deciding to succeed in at least breaking the galaxy in half. After the fall of Cadia, which is a whole nother tragedy for a different day, Abaddon gets this tip from a sorcerer, Zarfar Piston, telling him that something concerning is happening, and apparently a group called the Castellan Crusade had escaped the destruction of Cadia with a secret weapon that would actually flip the script in the Long War. Abaddon, being the ever-proactive, mustache-twirling Saturday morning cartoon villain that he is, detaches a massive chunk of his Black Fleet and sends it straight to Ultramar, and more specifically to Macragge. He didn't want to conquer a planet. He wanted to stop a miracle before it could even start. The group that Abaddon was so worried about is a who's who of the current Imperial legend. You had beings like Saint Celestine herself, Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, and Lord Inquisitor Greyfax. But the most interesting thing was that they were traveling through the webway with the help of the Ynnari, a rather new faction of Eldar led by the prophet Yvraine. This was the enemy of my enemy is my friend type situation that is almost unheard of in the 41st millennium. However, when they stepped out of the webway into the shrine world of Lapis in the Macragge system, they didn't find a welcoming party. Instead, they found the embodiment of the word mayhem, a war zone which forced them to immediately start blasting Helldrakes out of the sky just to get the local Ultramarines to listen to them. It was a chaotic mess. It was desperate, and it was the opening act for the biggest lore shift in Warhammer history. Once they convinced the Ultramarines that they weren't here to loot the place, the Castellan Crusade made a break for Macragge proper. But Abaddon's forces weren't far behind. The Black Legion and the Iron Warriors slammed into the planet for the first time in millennia. The Fortress of Hera, the most sacred site for the Ultramarines and Ultramar as a whole, was breached. Traders were pouring in by the thousands, and the fighting got so close that they were literally trading shots in the room where Reboot Guilliman was sitting in his stasis field. It felt like the end times had finally come. The Ultramarines were fighting a losing battle to protect the body of their father, while Call and Yvraine were frantically trying to hook up this mysterious life support system that looked an awful lot like a really cool piece of armor to the Primarch's throne. And then the impossible happened. Amidst the smoke and the screaming of chainswords, along with the literal magic of an Eldar god, the stasis field for the father of the Ultramarines, who had been slowly dying for a millennia, finally dropped. For 10,000 years, Guilliman had been a hair's breadth away from death. The very moment that the stasis field was gone, his life would be over. But with a surge of light and power, he stood up. You have to imagine, for a member of the Black Legion, one of those followers of the Long War, who had likely also fought alongside the Ultramarines and Primarch Reboot Guilliman, and just recently broken into his inner sanctum, expecting to see a dead corpse, you instead are greeted with the sight of an angry 10 to 12 foot tall demigod who has the wrath of ages stored up and ready to go on a rampage. He led a counterattack that didn't just push chaos back, he decimated them. And so the Avenging Sun was back in the Macragge system, and Macragge had its first sun leading again. And so the most powerful Administrator General in human history was back at the helm. This had to be the most mind-blowing thing that Abaddon has ever heard, because he had essentially successfully fully invaded Macragge, tearing through their orbital defenses, and on the ground the Fortress of Hera was buckling under the weight of the Black Legion. When the Castellans just show up and dropped a literal nuke on your army. Call actually knew Guilliman back in the day, and he revealed that he had actually completed the Big Blue Boy Scouts Break in Case of Apocalypse project around a few millennia ago. This also included the standing orders to find a way to bring as many Primarchs as he could back. And after 10,000 years, Call finally had the equipment alongside the aid of the Eldar to bring at least one of them back. But the Black Legion isn't stupid. They saw the energy spikes, they smelled hope building, so they launched this desperate all-out assault on the temple. Unfortunately, they found out that everybody within the temple had already been wiped out by the Big Blue Boy Scout, and now it's a total bloodbath. You've got the Castellans, which include one of the most brilliant Mechanicum Archmagos ever. You got a Brotherhood of Grey Knights, led by Grand Master Voldus, fighting against hundreds of Chaos Space Marines. You've got Dreadclaw assault boats smashing through the ceiling, Loyalists being pushed back inch by inch, but then there's the area where Reboot Guilliman is actually marching down. And despite the progress bar for Chaos being filled up to 99.9999%, they were headed for the setback of the century. Yvraine, being the prophet of another god, was able to actually bring the entirety of the soul of Guilliman back. And with Call's technology, they were able to stabilize the body, so him being dead, even for a microsecond, wasn't actually him being dead. And since he was no longer dead, well, everything in his path would be. The Avenging Sun, now back on his feet, had the reins of the galaxy basically turned over to him by Marneus Calgar. The storied and legendary chapter master of the Ultramarines handed the keys to the kingdom and basically his position over to his long dead father, who was no longer dead. Guilliman now was crowned Lord of Macragge and ruler of Ultramar, but he didn't stop there. He looked at the star maps and saw how the realms of humanity had shrunken over the centuries. Then effectively said, "We're putting the band back together." He immediately revoked the autonomy of the neighboring systems and declared the restoration of the great realm of Ultramar, all 500 worlds. Using his legendary Primarch tier genius, he spent the next 7 months systematically kicking chaos out of the entire sector and cleaning house. And it worked. In 7 months, he essentially brought back Ultramar to its former size. After that, he had to fix the problems that humanity caused with his father's kingdom. Even with Macragge safe, Guilliman knew his job was not done, not even close. He looked at the state of the Imperium, the decay, the religious fanaticism, the literal terror in reality, and realized he needed to talk to the man in charge. He couldn't talk to his father's proxies, so it was time to head to Terra. And for the first time in 10,000 years, he went to the cradle of humanity and kicked off what was known as the Terran Crusade. The journey back would be just as dangerous as the battle he had won. And this was basically for a while the end chapter for Macragge. Everything was basically settled, things were peaceful. Other than producing Space Marines, it didn't really need to do anything. Once on Terra, the High Lords kind of found out that a literal son of the God Emperor kind of outclassed them in rank, now taking the keys to the kingdom and becoming the man in charge of the war room on Terra. He began planning the massive thing known as the Indominus Crusade. As the Great Rift had torn open and split humanity in half, Guilliman was terrified that his homeworld was about to be snuffed out yet again, even if he was only away for a short amount of time. So he tasked a force called Fleet Avenger to go back to Macragge. This fleet was something incredibly precious. This fleet was carrying something incredibly precious, the very first Primaris Space Marines. These were a new breed, a veritable secret project between him and Belisarius Cull, which they had been cooking to not replace the Emperor's work, but rather to refine it, to add on to what the Emperor of Mankind had created. They were bigger, stronger, and more biologically and mentally stable than traditional Marines, and this fleet was to be led by the legendary Captain Cato Sacarius. But as they headed into the void, they hit a warp storm that looked almost like it belonged in the Age of Strife. And this wasn't just a storm. This was something known as the Noctis Athena. The night the light of the Astronomicon went black, and the story of Fleet Avenger ends on a chilling note. However, as most of the fleet limped back to Ultramar, but Sicarius' own ship, the Will of the Emperor, vanished for a while into the darkness. The last transmission the Imperium got from the ship until Cato got back was a mass of disturbing images and one final sentence: "The hull has been breached." But as Cato is alive and well in the current setting, we know that at least he survived. So you remember how I said that Macragge was one of the few places in the Imperium that was actually nice to live in? Well, Nurgle took exception to that. This is a chaos god of disease, despair, and he took this rather nice place not having disease or despair personally. See, Ultramar is a unique pocket where the Imperium and the worlds of humanity were actually disciplined, productive, and protective. Weirdly for this galaxy, this meant no toxic wastelands, no oozing muck, no mire of diseases. But after the Great Rift opened up, this bucolic beauty became a giant target. And so the Plague Wars would begin. This wasn't just a standard invasion, it was a literal attempt to turn all 500 worlds of the Ultramar system into a rotting garbage-filled garden of filth and decay. The Primarch Mortarion and his elite Death Guard even showed up at the front gates, bringing some of Nurgle's greatest hits, like the Great Unclean One, Kugloth, the Plague Father, and the legendary, traitorous Harbinger Typhus. Macragge itself didn't face one giant singular invasion this time. It dealt with something almost worse. Death by 1,000 cuts. We're talking about constant probing attacks by plague drones and constant cultist uprisings. Even a mutiny by the Ultramar Exilia in the Illyrium region, the same place Guilliman had spent his youth. It was a grind, as resources were constantly draining and morale was almost permanently slipping. The air itself became heavy with sickness. While naval battles raged on in orbit, the garden world of Lax was actually being turned into a literal swamp, and the Ultramarines, even on Macragge, were barely holding on. It felt like everything that Guilliman had built for millennia and everything he had rebuilt was going to melt under the touch and the focused aggression of the Plague God. But when the Avenging Sun came home, after spending around a century leading the Indominus Crusade directly to stabilize the majority of the Imperium, Guilliman returned to Macragge, and he was pissed. He didn't just bring reinforcements, he brought a master plan. He launched what was called the Spear of Espador, which was basically a master class in aggressive counter-striking and feints. All the while, the forces of chaos were often led fighting each other for glory, as the defenders of Ultramar were now perfectly synchronized under their Primarch's watchful gaze. Guilliman used daring boarding actions, rapid strikes, and assaults so sneaky, even the Raven Guard would think it was a daring move, to claw back every single inch of ground he could. He took the initiative away from Mortarion and forced the Prince of Decay to play defensive for a change. Everything would come to a head on the planet known as Lax, and it became a massive grinding stalemate where Guilliman countered every psychic plague and every tactical ploy Mortarion threw at him with his expert bureaucratic mind. Eventually, the forces of chaos realized they couldn't win a war of attrition against a Primarch in his very own backyard, so they set off a massive virus bomb to cover the retreat, and they vanished back into warp. And the war was kinda won, but not really, since the cost was so staggering, and every planet in Ultramar, even Macragge, was scarred in a way that it would take centuries to even begin to heal. The casualties were off the charts, and Guilliman didn't even have time to mourn, as he immediately started rebuilding defensive networks and organizing a new strike force to take the fight back to the enemy. This is basically the day in the life for Macragge. You survive one apocalypse just in time to prepare for the next one, only for it to hit you upside the head and another galaxy-shaking incident to happen. Now that we know the basic history, we should actually look at Macragge as a whole. So if you're actually walking on the surface of Macragge, you're going to notice that every single rock and hallway actually has a story that's probably 10,000 years old. But we have to start at the Hera Crown Mountains. These are the big boys, the mightiest mountain range on the planet, and where Rabut Guilliman himself decided to build the Fortress of Hera, the Ultramarines Fortress Monastery. And let me tell you, this isn't just some grim bunker or austere environment. It's actually an architectural marvel with golden geodesic domes, silver steel buttresses, and glass walkways that look way too graceful for a place that houses 7 to 8 foot tall super soldiers. It's a literal wonder of the ancient world, designed to be as beautiful as it was functional and impregnable. Then you've got Lyra. Now, if the Fortress of Hera is a crown, Lyra is a dark basement of Macragge's history. Back in the day, it was basically bandit country, a place where people who hated the government and who didn't want to pay their taxes went to hide. During the Horus Heresy, things got legitimately terrifying there, as the Night Hunter himself, Conrad Kurz, who had stowed away on the Dark Angel's flagship, escaped into its slums. He turned this whole region into a playground of mayhem until the Dark Angel's Dreadwing basically decided to level the place to get to him. Even 10,000 years later, during the Plague Wars, the rebellious spirit of this region hadn't died, leading to constant infighting and to any conqueror bubbling up in the area. Now inside the Fortress of Hera itself, you will eventually find the Library of Ptolemy. This is basically the holy grail for lore nerds, and it's named after the Legion's very first librarian. This place is rumored to contain practically every word ever written by humanity in all of its history, and it's where the original manuscript for the Codex Astartes is actually kept. But after Reboot Guilliman woke up, he ordered the library permanently sealed under the penalty of death. And he didn't do this because he hated books, but because he realized the Imperium had replaced the truth with superstition, and he wanted to lock away the past, including the potentially scandalous records of the Imperium Secundus, at least until humanity could actually understand what they were reading again. It has been basically what amounts to us as a symbolic timeout for the galaxy. And for those who don't follow the rules, there's Galen's Rock. This jagged station overlooking the waterfall where Guilliman famously beheaded the traitor Galen still stands to this day, and it is where the Ultramarines hold their executions for any Ultramarine who has committed serious enough crimes. This place was literally designed aesthetically to be a grim reminder that in Ultramar, justice is as sharp as the mountains themselves. Honestly, it's a very clever aesthetic. And you also have the Hall of Malexis, built for the 21st Chapter Master. His statue stands there with a stern but bright face, watching over every Marine who walks through, in a perfect blend of Macragge's ideals, extreme wisdom and cold hard justice, the kind that keeps a sector running for 10,000 years. So that's basically Macragge, a weird shining anomaly inside another weird shining anomaly, in a universe that prefers its planets on fire, covered in skulls, radioactive abominations, water that drinks you, giant ice storms and krakens, or even massive lava flows. It's a place where Roman discipline meets sci-fi super soldier, and it's all held together by the sheer will of a man who essentially is the galaxy's most intense and experienced middle manager. From the moment that glowing youngling pod hit the world, to the day the avenging sun woke up to fix the government for the umpteenth time, Macragge has been the heart of something the rest of the Imperium has long forgotten. Hope. It's not just a rock. It's the veritable blueprint for what humanity could have been if everything hadn't gone horribly wrong when Lorgar for the millionth time decided that his dad telling him religion bad, stay away from it, wasn't something he should listen to. To wrap things up, you have to really appreciate the irony. The Ultramarines are often called the most boring of the Space Marines because they follow the rules. But on Macragge, you see why those rules exist. Without them, the Tyranids would have digested the sector. The Black Legion would have burned their shrines, and Nurgle would have turned the Farmaris Ocean into a stagnant pond. The world remains a bastion because its people, from the lowest clerk to the chapter master himself, believe in the system. It's a fortress monastery that is also a university, a war zone that is also a home. It is the ultimate what-if scenario of what the Emperor's 41st Millennium could have looked like, and a world that is still standing against the dark even 10,000 years after the fall of the Emperor of Mankind. By all rights, Macragge is a planet that should be a footnote in the Tyranids of Justice system, Nurgle's hordes, the Black Crusade, or a myriad of other calamities. But it's still here, and much more intact than almost any other place in the galaxy. It's a veritable defiant middle finger to the entropy that is at the core of the 40k universe. And it's a one little shining bit of noble bright in the grimdark galaxy. After all that, I have to say thank you for watching. And remember, liking and commenting on the video really do help me in the algorithm. And subscribing is a great way to stay up to date with all the videos that I post.